Thank you so much for coming. And Antonio, I so enjoyed your presentation. Had food for thought. Oh my God. So what I'm going to talk about now is unashamed qualitative research. So flying the flag for the qualitative researchers amongst us and talking about boring on about justice. And my hope is by 2 o'clock, you too will be a social justice bore. So let's see how you are now after the sandwiches. So first of all, who is your one? I am what they call a specialist teacher assessor for specific learning difficulties. I trained in the UK, and this is kind of a qualification we don't really have so much over in Ireland. It's a mixture between an educational psychologist and a teacher. And a lot of the research I've done is about dyslexia in particular and about inclusion. And a shout out to my buddy Thomas O'Shaughnessy. He hates it when I shout out to him, but I do tend to do some research with inclusion with Thomas last year, and it was wonderful. So I'm somebody who is neurodivergent. I'm a late diagnosed person with dyspraxia. And I'm also somebody with an acquired disability. After COVID came along, I acquired a heart condition. So I'm no longer working as a researcher, as a lecturer, but I'm now working as a research assistant in the School of Allied Health, and it's fabulous. And I get to work with amazing physios like Professor Karen McCreesh, my wonderful PI, my lovely colleague Tara, and we love working with physios. They're amazing. So I'm so delighted that I've got to cross disciplines and to go work in health, and it's been really, really beneficial for me. So why did I want to talk to you today? Because, I didn't need to go do this. Well, first of all, one of my co-inquirers, she emailed me recently and she gave out to me and she said, what are you doing about your research? And I said, oh, well, I'm not a lecturer anymore. I'm a research assistant. She said, Sadhbh, you need to share this. So I said, okay, I will. And what I wanted to talk about is about the marginalization of neurodivergent students, but also the people who work with them. And might I say a big hello to my friends from Disability Services here today. I'm so glad you came because this is kind of about you guys and how important you are. And I wanted to say that I wanted to show about learning about social theories of justice is transformative, not just for students, but also for staff. Okay. So first off, I'm going to guide you to the books that have kind of guided me through this. And one of the key books that has changed my life is this book by Miranda Fricker called Epistemic Injustice. Now, don't be like me. I always get her confused with Brenda Fricker, the actress who was in My Left Foot. She used to play the curly-haired mammy, and she was also in Home Alone. But it's not her, okay? This woman is a professor of philosophy. She does works on ethics and epistemology, and she's fantastic because she developed that concept of epistemic injustice when someone is wronged specifically in their capacity as a knower, right? And in particular, I'm very interested in this idea about when somebody lacks the conceptual tools to make sense of their experience. Something's going wrong, but we don't know exactly how to name it, how to describe it. And when I read that, I went, Miranda, not Brenda, you're on the money, right? And she talks about two types of injustice in particular: testimonial injustice. You're not believed because of prejudice, you're not believed because you're a woman, or you're not believed because you're autistic. And in particular, she talks about this hermeneutical injustice. Now, hermeneutics, used to be back in the day the study of the Bible and stuff, but it's looking at words and language. And I've put a quote here from Chapman and Carroll. I love the work of Robert Chapman, right? He is a fierce fighting talk about neurodiversity. And he talks about how vocabularies are structured in a way that unfairly distorts or stifles understanding. And I thought that's really interesting. So one of those examples is, for example, the word neurodiversity. Neurodiversity always existed. And you know the way you'd have fellas come up to you going, oh, there was no ADHD in my day, or there was no autism in my day. Of course it was, but we didn't have the words to describe it. Okay, so neurodiversity is a great example of that, or sexual harassment might be another one of those. So I really like that, right? So when I read that, that made me go, and I was thinking, why does this matter? Well, neurodiversity professionals often face both types of injustice, right? We're not believed because we're working over there over disability services. Nobody listens to us, but also we may not know how to describe it. So that's why I really liked what you said over here on the, is it right hand, left hand side? Spot the dyspraxic, I can't tell which side. So somebody suffers hermeneutical injustice when there's a gap in collective interpretive resources that puts them at an unfair disadvantage when making sense of their social experiences. And I thought, Miranda, you're so right. And you know what's really interesting? There's a lot of research now that says that neurodivergent people often have a high sense of justice sensitivity. And I think that makes sense. If you've got neurodivergent children, you may have come across this. This is something that, for me, just sits in me. There's sometimes this is why you don't get promoted, perhaps, because you say things you shouldn't say, but you can't help it because it just drives you. So I really liked the work of Freire in that way, but I also liked how she talked about co-produced knowledge. And this, I think, would link in very well with what Antonio's fabulous presentation has told us about, the sense about co-production. And I'll talk more about that. So I just want to tell you a little bit more about neurodiversity practitioners. So when I was doing this back in the UK, I'd often work with people who are dyslexic or autistic, had ADHD, dyspraxia, a lot of people with acquired brain injury, actually, people with Tourette's. And actually, when we talk about neurodiversity, it's very common that people have co-occurrences, what, you might call comorbidities, I suppose, in more medical terminologies. But often, if you're dyslexic, you're very likely to be ADHD as well. There's often high links of co-occurrence. So we do a lot of academic work, emotional work, and advocacy work. Now, I was an assessor for neurodivergent conditions as well, but most people are just tutors, right? And in the UK, how they do this is slightly different to here. They have something called the Disabled Students Allowance. So it's a specific fund aimed at supporting neurodivergent students in university. But guess what? There's no research about them because who cares about these little people working over in a corner of the university? Nobody writes about them. Nobody cares about them. But I cared about them. So I want to show you a picture. When I was retraining to be a specialist teacher, this picture here by Sally Shavitz drove me mad. So this is a picture here of two brains. One is the non-impaired brain and the other is the dyslexic brain. Now, can you get the subtle hint there of the impaired, dyslexic, just not able, not capable brain? That really made me angry. Now, I felt that this is an example of kind of the deficit-led psychological models. I realize I'm speaking this in front of a professor in psychology, and don't get me wrong, psychologists are some of my best friends, but I felt that the training we received was all deficit-led. And there was no training at all about critical pedagogy, no training at all about social justice. And I felt I wanted to see if learning about social justice awareness was beneficial for tutors. And that's what kind of drove me on to do a PhD. I didn't need to do a PhD, but I was grumpy. And grumpy middle-aged ladies are often very likely to finish a PhD. So this is another book that kind of guided my thinking. Do you know this book by Tom Shakespeare? It's an old book, Disability Rights and Wrongs, but I loved it because when I first read it, I was like, oh my God, this all makes sense. Social justice isn't about the barriers, but I also really liked how he talked about the realities of disability, pain and fatigue and medical needs. And I'm having a bad day today, and I'm feeling the impacts of disability today. So it's interesting that, that kind of more nuanced approach is something that Shakespeare talks about. And I have to laugh, when I was working in the School of Ed, I did get somebody from a disability organisation to come in to talk to the students. And he said, oh, Tom Shakespeare, we hate him, splitter, splitter. So there's a lot of debate about Tom Shakespeare, but I really like that idea. And I really like that idea about reframing neurodiversity, where the onus is not just on the individual, it's about society too. So do you know what I did? I used collaborative co-produced methods, Antonio. Yeah. So I used a method called collaborative inquiry circles. And I think the best description of it is what one of my co-inquirers said. It was like a book club, but without the wine. So again, if there's any kind of, it was a lot of tea and biscuits, I have to say, as befits qualitative research. So what's nice about a qualitative inquiry circle is it's not exactly a focus group. It's a group process. There is a structure, but there is space for you to move in and out of it. It's used a lot in educational research. I've seen a lot of it used in the States. But I really felt that when I was doing research on inclusion, I should be trying to do this in an inclusive way. So I was very lucky that my research supervisors were, people who'd led the way in the UK and working on inclusive research methods. So they were very supportive of this and they said, off you go, Si, go try this. And I really liked it because it helped the participants feel like equals. And in fact, I didn't call them participants, I called them co-inquirers. And what I did was I gave them materials in advance of each of our sessions, and I gave them in a range of different formats. A lot of the co-inquirers were dyslexic themselves and neurodivergent. Giving them a whole ton of books wasn't going to work for them, but they needed choice in how they access things. And what was kind of an unexpected finding was that this collaborative inquiry circle was very brilliant for those who were neurodivergent. They all said to me, "So I love the way I can chat about something, come back to it and go chat about something and then come back to it." And they liked that elastic, non-linear approach. Now, if you are the person, however, directing it, you do have to be quite skilled because you have to let them off. It's like running a tutorial, you know, you have to let them chat and then bring them back into the room again. So it might not be so easy if this was your first time doing research, but you know, or if you hadn't a teaching background, being a teacher was one of the best things, actually. It really helped me become a researcher in that respect. So I really like doing that. So these are some of the books that we used. We did Bell Hooks, Theory as Healing. And I love that phrase. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me. And I felt that this is what I wanted my participants, my co-inquirers, to look at. In particular, I really like the bit that Bell Hooks writes about the margins as spaces of reflection, but also resistance. And a lot of these co-inquirers felt that they were on the margins, you know, that they were doing stuff, nobody was really innovative stuff, but nobody was noticing what they were doing. And one of the co-participants, actually, Shuri, was herself a Black American woman who had taught in the States and then had come over to the UK. And she was fantastic in this circle because she had a lot of knowledge about bell hooks that she'd read herself. And doing the circle was brilliant because I was able to let her lead on this. And she was fantastic about this. And one of the kind of key ideas that they really got behind from reading bell hooks was the idea that teaching should not be inaccessible or punitive. I know it sounds so basic, but it's so true. So that was one of the kind of main under findings we got when we read bell hooks. And then we got fierce old school altogether, but it might be old school for a lot of people, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. But my colleagues had never come across this before. They didn't know anything about this. And this idea, you know, that Freire has that education should be a form of liberation, not that traditional banking education where I'm standing up here telling you and you're just sitting passively receiving it, as I'm doing right now. So I felt that ADHD students in particular didn't benefit from this type of teaching. And they loved the idea of consciousization that Freire talks about, that you have this more awareness of social reality, of what's going on, what is impacting people, because of the societal impacts. And that's something they'd never thought about before. And one of them got fierce agitated altogether. She said, "You have to understand your role in the revolution." She was brilliant, right? And that person went on later on, I'll tell you that afterwards, she set up her own training company looking about the needs of Black students who are neurodivergent. So she's pretty cool. And she loved that book. And one of the key ideas that Freire has, you know, is that praxis about reflection and action, doing something about it. So they really loved that. And I'll tell you more about what they did afterwards. So here's another book. Okay, I love this guy, Henry Giroux. And I love him because he speaks like Mayor Quimby from The Simpsons. And he kind of looks like the Ramones. But I love him, right? Because he talks about teachers as transformative intellectuals. And they love that idea that they were clever, capable people, you know, that you're not a helper. You're there to do something really important. What's so interesting about Giroux is he writes about neoliberalism and the commodification of education. Isn't he so on the money? This is an old book, you know, and he's written recently about fascism in US colleges. Again, on the money. So Rosie, the co-inquirer who told me to come up and do this talk today, she said, "We have to fight. We are not important, but we are important." So one of the things that they made them think about was their own conditions. A lot of these tutors are self-employed through agencies, 0-hour contracts, no pensions, no holiday pay, no sick pay. So reading that book made them think about that a lot more and how unfairly they've been treated. And then my best friend here is Pierre Bourdieu. Now, my colleague Tara here, she knows all about Pierre Bourdieu because she's a sociology student. But if you weren't a sociology student, you wouldn't have come across the work of Pierre Bourdieu. I only did this because I was a weirdo who studied French in my first degrees, right? When he talks about habitus, He talks about capital and he talks about the field. And habitus as that internalized disposition that shapes your experiences, your capital, your economic or social or cultural capital, and then the field about that social space that we go in. And we talked about this and said that neurodivergent students can often lack that right capital to act in the right way. Now, when you think about the field isn't structured for them. So they really loved reading this because they linked it to neurodiversity. And they also felt they too lacked capital, that they weren't seen as academics, they weren't seen as lecturers, they weren't seen as researchers. And in fact, one of them described themselves as a ghost worker. And I thought, wasn't an interesting quote, you know? So that was Pierre Bourdieu. And then I showed them the work of Amartya Sen. Now, I really like Amartya Sen, but they didn't really like Amartya Sen. But he talks about that theory of justice, the capability approach. And that's your person's ability to do valuable acts or reach valuable states of being. And that we all have capabilities, but we might rely on functionings or things to help us achieve what's of value to us. So I thought this was interesting. But they thought that, yeah, of course, everybody's capable, but they found it was a little bit abstract. It wasn't very practical for them. In my own kind of life, I've used the capability approach when I'm looking at assessments, and I redesigned an assessment for dyslexic doctors using this approach. So maybe it's not so helpful for when you're teaching, but it might be more helpful maybe from a psychological kind of assessment point of view. Now, this was their favorite author. They loved Sarah Ahmed, right? I don't know if you've ever seen her blog, Feminist Killjoys. It's very accessible. It's great crack. She writes in a very easy way. And she talks about fighting out about injustice, often in higher education, disability workers who are often not treated well. So that idea of complaint is the work, that it's okay to complain. So if you're complaining, though, you're often seen as a killjoy or a space invader, you know. And they really loved, you see her, one of the key topics she talks about is about the shape of the door. And that's there on like the book cover. And she said, yeah, Helen said, yeah, we are the wrong shape for this door. They don't like us. We're not fit for this door. And the students aren't either. So they really like the work of Sarah Ahmed. And if you haven't read it before, I really recommend her. And so, yeah, the kind of findings we found was oppression and resistance, and very much that sense of working in a silo. I know, Antonio, yet again. So they felt that this sense of being oppressed, it has a negative effect on your well-being. But Rosie, my lovely, lovely colleague, she keeps writing to the Vice-Chancellor to complain. And she was wonderful because she felt that this is right. We are being oppressed here, and we should need to talk about our students, but also ourselves. And they felt that reading and learning about this validated their lived experience. And it was very interesting. They said, I do all this stuff, but I didn't know there were names for it. And it's about the language. You see here, it gave me the language to explain the oppression I've experienced. And what was interesting is the last quote here from Cara. She says, I feel validated. I feel academic. Now, isn't this interesting? People working in academia didn't feel that they were academic, even though that they were doing great work with students. So doesn't that make you think, what does it mean to be an academic? A lot of it's to do with the barrier that language causes. Martine, for example, is quoted here, she said, theory would make me hurt more. She was very dyslexic. And the way that theory is often presented wasn't accessible to her, but she liked the way we did it. And it just shows me that there's a need for accessible multi-sensory formats. And inclusion is not just for students, it's also for staff. And we often forget that. So what needs to change? Oh, systemic change. That's what we need. I think we need more training in social justice. There's more recognition that tutors are educators. We need more inclusive systems, not just bolt-ons. And that's what happens all the time. You're just an add-on. You add these things on. So what did our tutors do? Well, they decided out of all the books that they'd read, they wanted to apply the work of Freire, Bourdieu and Ahmed to their one-to-one sessions, to the kind of institutional advocacy, but also to contribute to curriculum design. Wasn't that a great thing? And here's some more of the things that we did. So Cara said you could do some really good, beautiful stuff from this. So we did collaborative training with, and this is the whole point. Collaborative work is about doing work with people. So we've done training for the trips off the tongue, Professional Association of Specific Learning Difficult Specialties in Higher Education over in England. And we've done work together I'm now writing an accessible guide to theory with them. I am kind of going to do my own work too, don't worry. But after doing this, what was so interesting, one participant decided to start a PhD. She was a very bright person anyway, but she said after doing this, she knew that she could cope with the language. She wasn't stupid. Two participants are now doing their own training sessions. And what's really interesting is that intersectionality of race and neurodiversity, which is often very much missing. And I thought that it was brilliant that they were doing this. Look, I'm the whitest person on the planet. They need to be doing this, not me. So it was really cool that they were doing that. So thank you very much to the co-inquirers. Without them, I wouldn't be here. And if you've any questions or a discussion, drop me a line. And here are some of the books that we used for this research. So thank you very much.
The creative approach. I'm really glad Rosie gave out to you.